Hello again, everyone. This is video lecture number 1, which I'm releasing to help you with the research article reflection paper assignment. As you can see in the syllabus, this is due on April 17th, the rough draft, and the final draft on May 18th. What we're going to be talking about here is also some ideas we'll be coming back to later in the class, but they'll be immediately used in preparing that research article reflection paper. So what I'm going to be talking about here is the genre of the scientific research article. So I want to begin with this idea of genre. So you may be familiar with this term, genre. We categorize types of novels, types of films into different genres. So you may have, you may speak of like a romantic comedy, Love Actually, for example, or you may speak of a horror movie, The Ring or The Grudge. You may speak of a drama. So we can identify different genres in novels and in films. And these are genres, types of genres in these areas are commonly recognized. But the literary theorist Mikhail Bakhtin, is a Russian literary theorist, he argued that the concept of genre should be used more broadly. That it doesn't make sense to just restrict it to films and novels. In fact, we can speak not just of written texts or other types of media like novels. We can use the term genre more generally to describe various types of spoken or written language. So for example, using Bakhtin's broader use of the term genre, we can understand how like a State of the Union speech is a certain genre, how a letter you might write on a postcard is a genre, how certain types of text messages could be genres. Even according to Bakhtin, like a shopping list would be a genre. So the term genre can be applied very broadly to describe various types of what? I said types of language, but the useful term here is utterances. Genres distinguish different types of utterances. Now, utterance is the second concept that we have from Bakhtin here. And it's, I think, a fairly simple one. By utterance, Bakhtin refers to a complete unit of language. Now, what does this mean? One example of an utterance would be a turn in a conversation. Someone asks you a question, you answer the question. So that would be two utterances. The question was an utterance, and your answer was an utterance. A speech would be an utterance, one single utterance. This video we could consider as an utterance. Bakhtin uses this concept of utterance also very broadly, just like the concept of genre. So for him, a novel is an utterance. A play is an utterance. You could also see the individual lines in the play as sort of sub-utterances. But now, there's a lot of complexity in unanswered questions here with the idea of an utterance, just as with genre. But where the terms are useful is that by considering the utterance as the unit of language, we can identify certain key characteristics that we see in any use of language. Specifically, what Bakhtin calls addressivity. Addressivity is the third very important concept here. Actually, I think the most important of the three concepts. So the term addressivity, highlighted here, addressivity refers to how utterances are always addressed to someone. Now, we all commonly overlook this. When we think of addressing something, we think of a letter as being addressed to someone, like, Dear John. But in fact, as Bakhtin and others have pointed out, every utterance is always addressed to a specific audience or to a more general audience. In other words, to put it in a better way, every utterance has the quality of addressivity. So by addressivity, we're looking at how what is said or what is written is shaped by the assumptions of who is being addressed. Who are we writing to? Who are we writing our novel for? Who are we writing the letter to? Who are we, we're writing a message to put into a bottle to throw out into the ocean. Who are we intending this to be to? Now, in the case of a message in a bottle, it's a good example. If you're writing a message and putting it into a bottle and throwing it out into the ocean, you don't know who's going to pick it up. It's just how messages in bottles work. But, as Bakhtin shows us, what you write, the way that you write, still assumes a certain type of audience. Furthermore, what you write is not just assuming the audience in the future, but it's also shaped by what has previously been said. Every utterance is shaped by preceding utterances. There's never a first utterance that, in Bakhtin's words, breaks the silence of the universe. Each utterance is always usually implicitly, a response to some previous utterance. Now, you can see this very explicitly in a conversation, where what you say is a direct response to what someone has previously said. You were addressing that person, and you're addressing them in response to what they had asked you, or what they had said to you. And so what you say is shaped by what they said to you. You can see this if you walk into a political debate. You walk in your front door, the political debate is on, you hear someone's answer, and to interpret what they're saying, you might wonder what had just been said. What are they responding to? That changes the meaning of what is said. Just as the person who's being addressed, the person who's being talked to, the audience, the intended audience, changes the meaning of what has been said. To illustrate the concept of addressivity a little bit more, consider how the same utterance, in other words, the same phrase, the same thing being said or written, could have very different meanings and could lead to very different responses depending on who is saying it. So, for example, if someone asks you, did you realize how fast you were going? The meaning of this and your answer and your interpretation would change completely depending on whether a casual acquaintance had asked you this or whether a police officer who has pulled you over has asked you. And your response would be not just a response to the literal words themselves, but a response to that person who said those words, who asked you that question. And not just that, your response is a response that anticipates their potential answer, anticipates the types of things that that person who asked you the question, your audience, your addressee, what they might say or do in response. So, one way I want to encourage you to consider addressivity is in terms of for any utterance, and in this particular context, we'll be focusing on the utterance of the peer-reviewed scientific research article. But we can look at addressivity in this context by examining the difference between, on one hand, in research articles or in any other type of utterance, what is made explicit on one hand, and on the other hand, what is assumed to be understood. This is just one aspect of addressivity, but I think it's a really useful one, looking at what is made explicit versus what is not made explicit, what is treated as if it's assumed that the audience understands that. By making something explicit, you are, in creating an utterance, with what you write, with what you say, you are presuming a particular type of audience, someone who needs to have that made explicit. On the other hand, there are other things that you leave implicit. And in doing this, you are also presuming a particular type of audience. So, classic example of this comes from the sociologist Harold Garfinkel. And Garfinkel had his students find a conversation, a naturally occurring conversation, and analyze it, specifically to identify in the conversation what was meant versus what was literally said. So in this diagram I'm showing here, you can see on the leftmost column are the two interlocutors, the two people having the conversation, the husband and the wife. Then in the middle column here is what each of them says, the literal words that each of them said. So the husband begins with, "Dana succeeded in putting a penny in a parking meter today without being picked up." That was what was made explicit. Then finally, on the right-hand column, we have the interpretation of what the husband meant by what they explicitly said. So Garfinkel's point is that there's a difference here between what the person literally said and what they meant. What they meant always goes beyond, there's always more that is meant than what is literally said. In other words, certain things are assumed to be understood in this conversation and in other conversations. So, for example, consider the first line in the conversation. Dana succeeded in putting a penny in a parking meter today without being picked up. So this was interpreted, and there's not just one interpretation of this, but this is a fairly reasonable interpretation. This could be interpreted to mean this afternoon, as I was bringing Dana, and which Dana? Not just any Dana. There's many people named Dana, but it's assumed that the wife will understand that the husband is talking about the son. So Dana, our 4-year-old son, home from nursery school, he succeeded in reaching high enough to put a penny in a parking meter when we parked in a meter parking zone. So again, it's assumed that he was able to reach high enough. He was able to do this in the face of particular sorts of impediments. It's not that he was legally prevented from doing it. It's not that he was financially unable to pay for the parking meter. Again, this is our interpretation. It's that he was able to reach up high enough, or maybe that he had the fine motor skills to put the penny in the correct place, or that he knew where to put the penny. There's many other reasons why you could be unable to put a penny in a parking meter. As I said, like not having a penny, for example. The wife's response to this is, "Did you take him to the record store?" Now, this question is interesting, this response, because it seems to come out of nowhere. Although they weren't talking about the record store, but it's interpreted that in this context, what the wife meant was, since Dana, the son, had put a penny in the parking meter, that means that you stopped while he was with you. I know that you stopped at the record store, either on the way to get him or on the way back. Was it on the way back so that he was with you, or did you stop there on the way? And the husband's response is, no, to the shoe repair shop. So if you just look at this middle column of the husband and wife's utterances, these first three utterances, they seem to be very disconnected. There is no obviously literal, sort of no connection that explicitly stands out between them. And yet the conversation goes on naturally. Did you take him to the record store? No, to the shoe repair shop. Interpreting this conversation that's going the way that it does with these first three utterances requires that we look at what is explicitly said as things that people are saying who assume that other things are being understood. So they're in what they're not saying, they are assuming that their audience understands certain things, whereas other things are made explicit. You know, the husband mentions that Dana was able to put the penny in the parking meter. The wife asks him, "Where did you go to?" This is not something that is, it's just assumed that they would have gone to this particular store. It's assumed that there were certain stores they might have gone to, the record store, for example, but it's not assumed to be understood which store at first, and so that's why it's asked explicitly. So, going back from this example, what I want you to do for the research article reflection paper is to, on Blackboard, go into the course documents section in the sample research article folder to find the articles in that folder, look them over. You don't have to read the entire article, but take a look at the articles, look at how they're written, pay close attention to what is being said in the article. How does the article begin? What things are explicitly said? And everything that's written in the article is explicitly said, but with what is explicitly said, to interpret it, for it to make sense, what is the author assuming that their audience understands? Now, another way to look at this, because one thing that comes up with reading research articles, and this is true for you and it's true for me, in many areas of research, I could find an article in seconds that would completely confuse me. One way to look at this is that I'm confused by the article. But another way to look at it is that the article is addressed to an audience who is not me. Now, research articles are not addressed to particular people. They're addressed to general types of people, a general type of audience. But when you read an article and it doesn't make sense to you, certain things don't make sense, something's said and it just makes no sense whatsoever. When we're analyzing the article in terms of addressivity, we can see this as not an example of our own ignorance, but an example of the author writing to a different audience than us. If they were writing to us, what they're saying, what they are writing or saying would make sense. So consider the conversation we looked at before between the husband and wife. What the husband said and what the wife said was phrased in a way, or articulated in ways that presumed certain understandings on behalf of their audience. So that they're presuming a certain audience. The wife is presuming the audience of the husband presuming the audience of the wife. And what they said in a way that implied the assumption of each audience having certain understandings. So when you look at research articles, I want you to identify two things. I want you to identify first an instance, and this is written on the syllabus in the research article reflection paper section, although I've just updated it today as of the evening of March 23rd. So be sure you're using the recent version. I want you to take a look at the research articles in the folder I mentioned, the sample research article folder, and I want you to then choose one and identify in that article. Let me copy this text here so you can see it. I want you to identify first something that is made explicit in the article, which implies the expected audience would not assume it to be the case. Also that because it's mentioned explicitly, it's something that the expect would be is assumed to be relevant to the expected audience. Then secondly, I want you to find something that is not made explicit, but is, in your interpretation, assumed to be understood. In other words, find something where the article is written, something is written in the article that assumes a certain understanding of things by the reader that is not made explicit in the article. So a really trivial example of this, I want you to find a better example than this, but a really trivial example of this would be, does the article mention that the researchers are studying human beings or versus some other animal? Or in the case of many psychology articles, it would be just assumed based on the audiences of certain journals, it would be assumed that the reader will understand that the research participants being talked about are human beings as opposed to monkeys or cats or mice or whatever. That would be a more trivial example, but it still illustrates the type of thing I want you to find in number 2, where the researcher, maybe they mention participants but don't explicitly say they're humans, but according to your judgment, you could assume that this is who the researcher was meaning to talk about. So that rough draft of this is due on April 17th, still a little ways off. Final draft then is due May 18th, the last day. So again, as always, let me know if you have any questions in doing this and identifying these 1 and 2 here, and then writing up a 1 to 2 page paper explaining in detail what you found. So yeah, email me with any questions, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. And I think this will be an interesting assignment. So best of luck on it.